Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us, joining the session on XDR, Extended Detection and Response, and how VMware is reshaping the future of security incident detection and response. Very excited about this session. I'm Tom Korn, Senior Vice President inside our Security Business Unit. I'm joined today by a great guest, Brad Doctor, our Senior Director of Information Security. Brad oversees all of the security strategy, architecture, engineering within VMware. And I think you're going to find this session really enlightening. We're very excited to walk you through this. Today, when you consider some of the challenges of securing critical applications and data, what becomes immediately apparent is that we need multiple camera angles on the applications and data to really do that. Because applications and data ultimately touch all different parts of the infrastructure. A patient care system is the workloads that composes it. It's how they talk to each other over the network. It's the network services they consume. It's the users connecting to it and the devices they happen to be using to connect to that system. And so as we think about securing in a particular incident detection and response, we really need to have all of these different camera angles. In fact, when you consider how an attacker breaches organizations, they don't attack the network, or an endpoint. They do combinations of things. It might be getting someone's credential to get onto their endpoint in order to connect to that workload, in order to move laterally across the network. The challenges today about doing security incident detection and response effectively are really staggering and have been steadily growing, and I think they can be boiled down to these five challenges. The first is, and as I go through these, and Brad, I'd love to get you to chime in as we go through each of these. The first is the detection challenge. Now, when we think about detecting attacks, and we go back historically, early days, we were reverse engineering attacks and essentially creating signatures or fingerprints. Then we ran into the challenge that there were new attacks coming out all the time, so you had to figure out how to accelerate that. There were variants of attacks. At some point, the volume became so staggering that we used various methods to have fuzzy logic to find something that looks close to a malicious executable. But that has continued. The attack surface has continued to evolve to the point today where ransomware or the increasing non-malware, fileless, living off the land attacks are actually much more about finding malicious activity, people using good software maliciously as opposed to malicious software, and that's created a very different challenge in terms of detection. It's forcing us to think about looking at the actual activity as opposed to just to the executable. And of course, as we think about attacks in the context of all the surfaces someone touches, it's about looking at activity across these domains.
Tommy, you mentioned credentials and malicious executables, and like you said, the traditional AV is just about looking for bad things. If you think about XDR, EDR, it's looking for poor behavior, things that don't look quite right. Think about like a ransomware pivot from an endpoint into the network. It's using credentials that it's gotten from the endpoint. Somehow it got a foothold there. But it's logging in as a legitimate user using legitimate credentials for very poor reasons, of course. And so how do you detect that? You might see some of the activity on your endpoint, but once it gets across the VPN, across Wi-Fi, what have you, into the corporate network, now what do you have to detect? And that is a huge challenge because, the bad guys, so to speak, don't want to be seen. They don't want to be found. So they're very quiet, right? They're using legitimate methods to access, and it's very, very difficult to detect any of that activity.
Brad, as you're saying, the advent of EDR really goes directly to trying to solve this problem. The advent of NDR, network detection and response, goes to this problem. But aligning these is increasingly an outstanding challenge. The other challenge that we tend to see is the investigation challenge. Now, the reality of investigation is much more than what you do in a traditional SIEM of correlating alerts. right? It's actually the real material work in an investigation is not just looking at alerts. It's actually looking at the activity. It's about saying, I've detected something suspicious in the previous stage. I need to find everywhere where that's occurring, and I need to find all the ways that, how did they get to that point, right? I have something suspicious going on workload B. How did they manage to get to workload B? Where else am I seeing this? Where have they gone since they've touched onto workload B? And that means we have to have the data to support that.
Yep.
We have to have the means to navigate that data, and we need to have that data from multiple dimensions.
We need to have the evidence, right? Investigations rely on evidence to conduct any sort of investigation, anyway. And so, again, the word telemetry comes to mind, because look at EDR, XDR, NDR. It's not necessarily, hey, these bad things happen. Of course, they'll be part of it as needed, but it's the fact that these events happened at all. And so when you start your investigation, the first thing you want to do is find patient zero where whatever came in, however. Because from there, if you got proper telemetry, it should be pretty clear where they went. Now, of course, the reality of getting there, to that level of sophistication and is far different than actually, doing it. But that's the goal. And so XDR, EDR, all that type of telemetry is meant to give you that picture of what happened on the endpoints, network, and servers.
Right, and if we follow up on what Brad was just saying, and then move to that next stage of getting into the actual incident response challenge, where we need to figure out how do we contain and then clean and then inoculate the environment so that we're not fighting the same fire again. Again, we find this cross-domain theme becomes very important. And often it's for many reasons. One of the reasons is that often we will find that responding on a different domain than you detect on becomes very, very useful. An example here is when you quarantine a user machine, you block all network communications except to the patching server. It's not always a wise idea to do that for a workload. If this is workload B is an app server as part of the patient care system, it's part of a larger system. And so the other things are very reliant on that being there and operating in a certain way. So you can have the cure, so to speak, could be worse than the disease. You could be rippling that response problem through it and taking down. So you may want to instead be responding on the network domain and how you control the load balancers and think about quarantining the segment of the applications and really think about it in terms of preserving the integrity of the larger system.
You think about like a false positive, it's one thing if it's just an alert into the SOC, that's a problem, of course, but it's entirely another if you block something, if you took something down. All the value of that control system just evaporated. Another way I look at this, though, when I think about incident response, think about incident responder, right? Someone actually doing this, investigating an incident. And, again, having that telemetry, the evidence, of course, is critical, but it's critical for the business because as the CISO, that person has got to be able to tell the board with definitively what happened. Here's how it came in, here's how we detected it and how quickly we detected it, here's what we did to stop it, and here's the scale and scope of the incident. And here's what we did to correct it and make sure it's not going to happen again. You can't do that, or you can, of course. The reality is you often have to do it with sparse information. But ideally, you don't have sparse information. Ideally, you've got the clear picture. Again, reality versus want is very different, but that is the goal. And that information is going to make or break the confidence in an InfoSec function within a company.
Yeah. So let's take these three challenges we laid out, and the next two challenges actually relate to all of them. One is the time challenge. We have to do this quickly. When you consider dwell time, the amount of time from the time the attacker actually manages to get into the environment and then work through there's different stages of attack. The time it takes for us to get to that and then get to the stage of understanding it and then reacting to it, that dwell time, it is often measured in very large numbers, right? And minutes count, hours count, days count, weeks count, months count. We need to figure out how to shrink this time. And there's another dimension of time, which is the time of the people who we're relying on to do this. This is a manually labor-intensive task. This requires very high expertise. We are facing a massive talent shortage, very hard to find and retain key talent. So we need to figure out ways of better leveraging those assets and shrinking this dwell time.
The reality is the longer someone has a foothold on the network, the longer the dwell time, the more the potential damage and the less confident you can be about what actually happened. Verizon puts out a yearly report, DBIR, and in 2020, they said that, I'm sorry, in 2019, they said that 56% of breaches took months or longer to detect. Let's keep in mind, dwell time is the period between when something happened and when it was detected. Not solved, not fixed, right? Detection. Now, the good news is in 2020, 81% were resolved in days or less. So that's a big improvement. But dwell time really is a critical factor and also a good top-level indicator of how effective the whole ecosystem is for your company, your organization, when it comes to InfoSec. And the goal for the practitioner is to get dwell time to zero, ideally. It'll never happen, but to get as low as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. The final challenge I guess we'll talk about is this distributed enterprise challenge. And that is that as we become increasingly a distributed organization, this so-called hyper-extended enterprise, more and more of the activity that we need to detect, investigate, and respond is not observable on our corporate network, is not observable inside our data centers or inside our campuses. And of course, this has been exacerbated recently with the COVID pandemic and the increasing work from home, where we've had massive increase, of course, in the number of employees that are working from home in organizations all over the world. But all indications lead to this is not something that suddenly goes back to the way it was tomorrow. So we'll be dealing with very distributed workforces and increasing consumption of SaaS and infrastructure as a service. So how do we detect, investigate, and respond when this is not observable in our corporate environment?
And shadow IT has been around forever, that word, right? For a good reason, because it's even more so today. If the credit card is saying go, you can go, develop your own IT department in AWS or anywhere else. This is a very difficult challenge. There's no question, and there aren't great solutions that cover the whole scope. But you have to come back to fundamentals, which is your data, your colleagues, your end users, right? The things that you do have visibility on, and so. Ultimately, the data is coming from our computers, whatever that computer may be, into the cloud. And so that's where the focus can be most successful today. For CASB, there are lots of products for your problems, of course, as usual with InfoSec. But the reality is that there's not one good solution. It's really layers, right? Defense in depth, monitoring in depth, telemetry in depth.
Yes. So these 5 challenges. And this has really prompted us to start thinking more broadly as an industry about how we start to rethink how we're doing security incident detection and response. Now, again, some of this, the ball started rolling with the advent of EDR, Endpoint Detection and Response. And then, of course, you start to see that trend happening in other domains like network detection and response as an example. But what this is really doing is starting us to think about this movement towards XDR, extended detection and response. And the difference between XDR and some of these traditional approaches, or even just relying solely on SIEM to be the main investigative tool, is really these 5 sort of pillars. It changes based on the type of data that we're looking at. It's a lot less just about events and a lot more about what activity is actually happening and the behavior of these systems. The analytics changes because you're looking at behavior and understanding malicious behavior and not simply malicious executables, for example, and connecting the dots so you can have the timeline so that when you rewind the cameras, you can see kind of what happened. It is by definition cross-domain, right? If we're thinking about this metaphorically as, we've spotted suspicious activity in a room, we need to have cameras in the hallways to see how did they get to the room, and cameras on the keypads in the room to what combination did they put in, what credential do they possess. The other 2 really address the time challenge and this hyper-extended enterprise challenge. It's a very big focus on automation. Automation is going to be key to reducing dwell time and creating more leverage for the analysts. And cloud, I think this is one of the things, it's not the only thing, but it's one of the reasons that more and more analytics are starting to move to the cloud. Because when security becomes increasingly distributed, more and more security by definition has to move to the edge. It makes no sense to suck all of this data back into a data center in some place to try to sort it out. There are, of course, other advantages to that as well. So think about XDR as a unified security incident detection and response that is sort of different on these dimensions. And from a context perspective, it is looking across domains. And even from a control perspective, where you can enforce policy is across domains. Now, the way we're thinking about this is actually much larger than some individual product. And it's really along these 5 dimensions. One is this notion of an XDR cloud platform, the idea of being able to do XDR analytics actually in the cloud to deal with the fact that we're dealing with a hyper-extended enterprise. The second is XDR threat intelligence. It's going to force us to change how we think about threat intel, not thinking about it on just endpoint security threats or network security threats, but looking at threats from multiple dimensions. It's also about XDR-enabled controls, right? Thinking about how the controls we have in the environment can work seamlessly with the cloud platform and also take advantage of context from other domains. XDR-enabled infrastructure is about work we're doing to embed some of these controls into the infrastructure itself so that they can be agentless, they can be architecture into the environment as opposed to bolted onto the environment. And of course, an ecosystem is important because this is not just about securing things on a VMware infrastructure or on a particular VMware control, but anywhere we have attack surface, right? And no one company is going to have all the solutions. It's very important to be able to work with the things that you have. Lastly is a reference architecture and playbook for how you piece these things together and good tips and tricks about how to think about, even from a team perspective, how do you operationalize this? So when you look at where we are today in terms of that, right, you'll see us starting to evolve the Carbon Black Cloud to really become our central focus around this XDR cloud platform. And some of the integrations that you've seen over the last year and some of the big ones that were announced at VMware World, at this VMware World, where we're now we've launched the Carbon Black workload and taking things in from the vSphere platform and from VMware Cloud Foundation, but also the integrations we've done with Workspace ONE. So now we can cross domains, and now you'll see us, Carbon Black Cloud, being able to leverage Workspace ONE. So for example, it can respond using access control as a mechanism for users, not just on the endpoint and workload. And then of course, over the coming months, and you'll see more and more integrations surface on the network side with NSX. We obviously did some big announcements with Kubernetes, and you'll see that follow on with some integrations with Tanzu and work we're doing with Cloud Health and Secure State in terms of configurations on the public cloud, not just the workloads with Carbon Black and the network pieces with NSX. So Carbon Black Cloud, you're starting to see expand beyond just endpoint and workload and really think about context from multiple domains and enforcement points from multiple domains, starting with some of these integrations, even just with our own platforms and controls, and then expanding as we do more with our ecosystem. In terms of threat intel, we're investing very heavily on the threat research teams we've had. And this isn't just adding more staff, for example, to the Carbon Black Threat Analytic Unit, but expanding the skill sets and what kind of dimensions those teams are working on. Earlier this year, we acquired a company called Lastline in the network detection and response space. They have a network threat research team. We've combined these teams. And what the teams will start to do is think about studying threats and articulating threats across multiple dimensions, as opposed to siloed at a network layer or an endpoint or workload layer. There's enormous promise in that. XDR-enabled controls, the example that you're seeing already, the example I have here is NSX's service-defined firewall, right, which has segmentation, IDS, IPS, NDR. As an XDR-enabled control, it's able now to take in identity context as well as workload context. So when you're defining a microsegment, you can define it policy based on the user group. If you're microsegmenting a bunch of virtual desktops, the contractors who are using desktops should only be able to go here. Or authoritative context from the workload is an enormous benefit in terms of defining segmentation policy or evaluating some network traffic stream. In terms of the XDR-enabled infrastructure, a great example of things that we've just done, you saw us announce earlier what we've done embedding Carbon Black and some of the NSX advanced security functions right into VMware Cloud Foundation. So you can have with VCF, which is a package to basically build a private cloud out of your hardware with compute, network storage, management, and now it has all the tools. It's not only instrumented for XDR, it has the complete stack to do cloud workload protection from top to bottom, built right into the infrastructure. And then, of course, a great example on the ecosystem is some of the announcements we've done several months ago about our advanced SOC initiative, where we've announced some advanced partnerships with players in the SEM space and the SOAR space, complementing some of the work we've done in the service management space, the threat intel space, and increasing partnerships with other controls in other environments. And the idea is this needs to work not just for VMware environment, it needs to work across all of this. It has to be able to leverage the things that you already have. But this gives us the framework to be able to do this and have these work together. Now, as you think about this holistically, think about at the center, understanding the threats, and an XDR-enabled threat intel that can feed the cloud platform. That's the analytics layer that can also take in the context about the assets that you're already using, but to be able to make those, right? And that gives us more accurate detection, faster investigation and response. As we then surround that with XDR-enabled controls, now we have much more accurate and surgical prevention. When you surround that with XDR-enabled infrastructure, now you have that built into many of the platforms and the infrastructure that you're using, so you're not bolting on controls and sensors and agents. And you surround that with an ecosystem, and now you have something that is extensible across your whole environment. And that's the central idea here. Well, there's a lot to digest. But it is something that you can get started now. It's really exciting about the pieces that are here today, especially some of the more recent announcements. And I guess the best call to action is to start getting smarter about some of the things that exist today and where these are going. VMworld is a wonderful opportunity to do that. There are so many sessions that you can take a look at. In terms of the cloud platform, there's a session I'm actually doing called the Future Ready Security Operations Center. And actually, Mustafa Keba, who's the Chief Security Officer for Brinks, is joining me for that. There's a keynote called Intrinsic Security Advantage that Patrick Morley is doing with Sanjay Poonen that's terrific. We have sessions on cloud infrastructure and workload security with Secure State and Carbon Black thinking about public cloud, and a wonderful session on becoming a threat hunter, all to get smarter about the XDR cloud platform. Great assets in terms of threat intel. We have a session on how threat intelligence can help your security posture. And we have a series of reports on the website that are really insightful. There's a number of sessions on XDR-enabled controls. Right? There's one on the service-defined firewall I was mentioning earlier. There's an intro to the Carbon Black workload that we're building, right, specifically for workloads. On the XDR-enabled infrastructure, we have a bunch of sessions that get into the work we've done embedding into VCF, VMware Cloud Foundation, including on the network, on the session on Zero Trust and how VMware IT reimagined security resiliency. Brad, is that the session that you're actually conducting?
It is, yeah. Yeah, please join.
That's one you should definitely see, because you can now get to see it through the eyes of someone who lives it and actually protects a major corporation. And then there was a bunch of great assets in terms of better understanding the XDR ecosystem. There's a session called about SOAR and integrations with the SOAR players. There's a white paper that was just released on the top 3 essential endpoint integration use cases that also gets into some of these cross integrations and other sessions. So there's a wealth of really good talks going on across VMworld that you'll be able to watch and download, as well as papers on the website to make this smarter. This is a big focus for us, and we're in I think a very unique position to think about this much more holistically. So thank you so much. We appreciate you joining us. I hope this has been a helpful session. We're incredibly excited about. We're really investing heavily in. And Brad, thank you so much for joining us today. I always learn so much from your insights of fighting the battle every day.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity. It was really fun.